Good afternoon and welcome to the sixth meeting of the COVID-19 Committee. We are joined today by Hamza Yousaf, Cabinet Secretary for Justice, and we will be considering two statutory instruments relating to the early release of prisoners. And as they are linked, the Cabinet Secretary will take questions from the committee on both instruments at the same time, rather than doing so under two separate agenda items. Members will have received a clerk's paper providing background and procedural information, along with written submissions that have been received from the Criminal Justice Voluntary Sector Forum and the Howard League Scotland. Before we move to questions to the Cabinet Secretary, we have apologies today from Adam Tompkins and Ross Greer. We have Liam Kerr attending today as a substitute for Adam Tompkins and Patrick Harvey attending as a substitute for Ross Greer. So I'd like to start by inviting Liam Kerr to declare any relevant interest.
Thank you, Convener. Simply that I'm currently a practicing solicitor and I'm a member of the Law Societies of Scotland and of England and Wales.
Thank you. And I invite Patrick Harvey to declare any relevant interests.
Thank you, Convener. I don't think I have any interest relevant to this committee, but obviously everything's recorded in the register for people to see.
Okay, thank you. The Cabinet Secretary is joined today by Scottish Government officials, Graham Robertson of the Community Justice Division and Craig McGuffey of the Legal Directorate. If the Cabinet Secretary would like the officials to contribute to the discussion, if he just makes that clear at that point, and if I could just remind everyone to take a breath before they speak so the cameras and microphone can be switched on at the relevant point. So I now welcome the Cabinet Secretary to the meeting and invite him to make a short opening statement.
Well, firstly, let me thank you, Convener, for allowing me to give evidence on the two regulations for you today. Both, as you rightly say, relate to prisoner release. The first, SSI 2020/138, that sets out the classes of prisoners eligible for release and how that release is being phased. The second, SSI 2020/137, makes a number of necessary changes to the victim notification scheme so that it applies to those released under the early release arrangements, and it also makes provision so that the power to veto release, which is conferred on governors, will also extend to the directors of private prisons in Scotland. In bringing forward these regulations, I'm clear that allowing for a limited release of prisoners was a necessary action to protect the health of all those who live and work in our prisons at this time, and to mitigate the impact of coronavirus on our prisons overall. I'm also very grateful to colleagues across all parties for the constructive way in which they have approached this issue. I know that the Parliament unanimously agreed to the Coronavirus Scotland Act 2020, which put in place the necessary legislation to permit the early release of prisoners if it became necessary to do so. And after careful consideration and in agreement with the Scottish Prison Service, it became clear that it would be necessary for action to be taken. So on the 21st of April, I announced to Parliament my intention to bring forward regulations, and we laid the relevant regulations before Parliament on Monday, the 4th of May. Those regulations set out the criteria for those eligible for this release process, with the key limits of serving a sentence of less than 18 months and being 3 months or less from their release date. There are safeguards in the Act itself, which exclude, for example, prisoners who have committed sexual offences or terrorist offences. These regulations have added further exclusions in relation to domestic abuse and harassment. And the governor's veto is also in place, where a governor considers that the person, if released, would pose an immediate risk of harm to an identified person. While all the individuals within the eligible cohort would in any event be released from prison at their liberation date over the next 12 weeks, I believe this was a proportionate set of safeguards to put in place. Work is very much underway to assess all the eligible individuals, and appropriate individuals will be released over the course of this month. I'd now like to give a brief update on the release process so far. I've been advised by Scottish Prison Service Management that the administration of the process has been progressing to plan. As of yesterday evening, 240 individuals have been released early since the process began, and Governor's veto has been applied in 55 cases in total. And on Tuesday of this week, statistics on the release process were published on the SPS website. Further information will be made available on the SPS website as each phase concludes. Plans for the release process were worked out in advance with local government, housing services and the third sector. COSLA leadership, the Association of Local Authority Chief Housing Officers, Social Work Scotland and other stakeholders have been closely involved in this work, and I personally have been in regular contact with Councillor Paddy at COSLA, as well as third sector partners such as the Group, DACO. Feedback from Justice partners suggests that the release process has been operating effectively overall, with support available to those individuals that need it. We already know that prison release can be a challenging time, so I'm grateful for the way partners have come together to share data and undertake the release planning. I've said before, this was not an easy decision or one that we would have taken lightly. I'm acutely aware of the impact that these releases may have on those who've been victims of crime, and this decision should not diminish what they have experienced. That is why it was important that through these regulations, the victim notification scheme was modified to ensure any victims who are already registered with the scheme will be notified if a specific prisoner is to be released. I would, of course, now, Convener, be more than happy to answer any questions members have on the release process and the details of these regulations.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. That's a very helpful introduction. Can I ask members who want to ask supplementaries to type an R in the box at the relevant point, and I'll try and bring them in as best I can. If I can just start off with a couple of questions, Cabinet Secretary. You referred to the victim notification scheme that allows victims who've signed up to the scheme to be notified of an offender's early release. Can I ask what proportion of eligible victims have actually signed up to the scheme? And is there a risk that some victims may not currently be registered but intended to do so closer to the original anticipated release date and might therefore not be notified as an unintended consequence of the regulations?
Well, thanks for that question, Convener, a hugely important one. I'll come back to you in writing, if I may, in terms of the actual percentage of those who are eligible. I think it's quite important as a caveat or a bit of context, if nothing else, to make the very obvious point, I think, which you'll understand and others will as well, but nonetheless is worth making, that of course not every victim would want to be notified if a certain prisoner was released. We know that from talking to Victim Support Scotland, that that could re-traumatise that individual if they had any knowledge of a prisoner being released. So we know that there's some victims that simply do not want to know, and that's just an important bit of context. It's important also to say that any victim can opt into the victim notification scheme at any point. So the fact that they weren't as part of the scheme previously, it doesn't mean that they can't now opt into the scheme. And what the Scottish Prison Service have done is made that as easy a process as possible with a link onto the website and a phone number by which people can call in to opt into that scheme. There have been since March a number of people who have opted into the scheme, and again I can get you the exact detail. I think the numbers were in around the 30 mark, but I can get you the detail of the exact numbers after the committee. But yeah, I mean, if there is ever a danger of victims being left out, then it's really incumbent that in my engagement with Victim Support Scotland, I certainly will ask that question, but it's incumbent that we do everything we can to make this process streamlined and as easy as possible for victims.
Thank you very much. Secondly, can I ask, the release of prisoner regulations are a provisional or what's known as a made affirmative instrument, meaning the provisions came into force immediately when the regulations were laid. But of course, Parliament did not at that point have a chance to consider them. What would happen in the event that Parliament decides not to approve the regulations within 28-day period, particularly given that there are prisoners who have already been released earlier than specified in their original sentence?
Yeah. Again, look, I appreciate the question. Convener, I hope that you and others will appreciate that we had to take these measures again at a pace because of the nature of the crisis and the nature of the crisis we're facing within our prisons in particular, which, as I see from the evidence we've received from the Howard League, for example, we know that prisons can be a real incubator for the virus. So really important that we took action quickly that we thought was necessary and proportionate. To give you a direct answer to your question, those releases would still be lawful. Once an individual has been released, they are released. There would be no question if Parliament decided not to approve of those releases being recalled back into our prisons. That just wouldn't happen legally. What I can give an understanding, of course, the importance of parliamentary scrutiny. If, for example, after this committee, the committee does not approve the regulations, if Parliament does not approve the regulations, I will reflect on that, because bear in mind, at any point, a minister can withdraw those regulations. So I will reflect very carefully on what this committee says and what the final outcome of the committee and the Parliament is.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Right, I have a number of members who want to come in and ask questions. Firstly, we have Annabel Ewing, and after Annabel Ewing, it will be Willie Coffey. But Annabel Ewing, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good afternoon, Cabinet Secretary and colleagues. I have two questions which relate to practical issues surrounding release. And the first is concerns have been expressed that in some cases release is being organised with less than 24 hours notice, and that obviously would involve practical challenges in a number of respects. And it would be helpful to seek clarification from the Cabinet Secretary on that point. My second question, I'll just roll them up together. My second question involves concerns raised about the fact that in some instances face coverings are not being made available to the released prisoner, who has to get from the prison to the home area, often on public transport. So perhaps the Cabinet Secretary can again provide some clarification on that issue. Thank you.
Thank you for those questions, and I'll take both of them in turn. In relation to prisoners being released on less than 24 hours, what would be probably helpful to a point to make at this point would be that, remember, there are already prison releases that are ongoing. So there's the early release scheme, and of course there is the weekly prisoners that we released any given week, and that number could be anywhere between 100 and 150 prisoners. And what tends to happen is that local authorities are given 12 weeks notice of prisoners that may be released in their local authority area. And that process has also continued for those that would be on early release as well. So there should be quite a lot of advance notice. The issues that you refer to, and you rightly refer to those where there was less than 24 hours notice, they may well have happened very much at the beginning of the process, and that is regrettable. But certainly I'm confident that the procedures we now have in place mean that not only local authorities but other partners. I've spoken to the third sector about this. I've spoken to Councillor Parry from COSLA, who is my counterpart, and I've been assured and reassured that the level of information, detail about every prisoner is not just satisfactory, but coming in a tedious manner as well. So hopefully that has resolved that issue, but I don't take away from what you say in relation to perhaps some of the challenges we faced at the very beginning of the scheme. I think you make a really important point around face masks. Forgive me, I'll need to go back and speak to the prison service on the detail of that. What I would say is, again, you'll know this, of course, the face mask guidance or the advice on face masks is advice. It's not mandatory. have to wear face masks on public transport. Notwithstanding that, I think it is an important point. So let me see what provision we have in relation to that appropriate piece of PPE, but what supply of face masks we have within the prison service that are suitable as face coverings, and let me come back to the committee, because if there's something we can do in that regard, then I'm more than happy for us to be proactive in that respect.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Annabel, do you want to come back in on that?
It was just to say, sorry, Convener, to cut over you, that I think it would be helpful if the Cabinet Secretary did get back to the committee on that point, because I think it seems to be where we're all moving to in the next phase, to be wearing face coverings in appropriate circumstances. Travelling in public transport would appear to be one of those, and it would appear, therefore, that the face covering should be made available, but we can look forward to clarification in writing, perhaps, from the Cabinet Secretary. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Annabel. I'll now go to Willie Coffey, and after Willie Coffey, it'll be Liam Kerr. Willie Coffey, please.
Right, thanks, Convener, and good afternoon, Cabinet Secretary. As you know, many constituents and victims will be understandably anxious about the changes that you've announced. It is welcome, though, to see that certain categories of prisoner, including those convicted of sexual offences and those in prison for life, will not be eligible for early release. However, I know that there are a greater number of remand prisoners are being released on bail because their trials can't proceed. We know that, but this too is giving some cause for concern. Some women are genuinely in fear for their safety. Could you outline, or at least give us some assurance, that any additional measures that might be required will be taken to ensure the safety of these women and their families?
Thank you to the member for the question. Again, I suppose the important context and caveat to my answer should be that of course, bail decisions and remand decisions are made independently by the court in all circumstances of the case. And it should be said that in the statutory framework around bail and remand, there is very explicitly in black and white the consideration that has to be taken for public safety. So any kind of substantial risk of a person committing further offences, or any substantial risk that a person might, if granted bail, interfere with witnesses, for example, they are good and valid and absolutely appropriate reasons within the framework for refusing bail. And no change on that, no change whatsoever has been made in that respect during this COVID-19 pandemic. So I suppose that is the important point to make. It is a challenging one because, of course, when it comes to those prisoners that are untried, they've not been convicted and therefore, must by law benefit from the presumption of innocence. What I would say is that almost every conversation I have with the Chief Constable and the Lord Advocate from obviously the Crown side, both of those individuals and the organisations they represent are absolutely alive and alert to the dangers that victims and survivors of domestic abuse may well suffer, particularly as a result of lockdown measures. And not just women in particular, but also children as well. So there is a power of work being done by Police Scotland in particular, alongside our partners such as Scottish Women's Aid, to make sure that we are doing absolutely everything possible to mitigate as best as possible some of the risks for those that are facing domestic abuse.
Could I just follow up on that, Convener? Cabinet Secretary, do you think there need to be some kind of additional assessment of this, given that there are bound to be more of this category of prisoner being released on bail because of the circumstances that we find ourselves in? Just there are a greater number, perhaps, of prisoners being at liberty because of this. So should we have a little bit of a closer look at that to assess any additional risks that might be involved here?
As a general point, I'm always happy to have a closer look, of course, and I'll pick this up with the Scottish Courts and Tribunal Service, and also more than happy to have conversations with other appropriate stakeholders. I just must reiterate the point that, of course, and I know you know this, of course, bail decisions are ones for the independent courts to make. And I just go back to the point I made in my previous answer that the reasons to refuse bail in relation to public safety, risk of harm to an individual, none of that has changed. So I don't have the figures, of course, in front of me, but I will take a closer look and I will ask the question. But there is no evidence thus far that I've seen that would indicate that more individuals are being granted bail in relation to potential domestic abuse cases. But I will go and take a look at that and certainly speak to partners on the ground like Scottish Women's Aid, who tend to have a good ear to the ground in these matters.
Okay, thank you for that. Thanks, Hamza. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thank you, Willie. Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. And I'm going to Liam Kerr, please, and after Liam Kerr, it will be Monica Lynn.
Thank you, Convener. Good afternoon, Cabinet Secretary. I've 2 or 3 quick questions on the prisoner release regulations. The first, down south, they were obviously faced with similar challenges, and I believe one of the remedies that they looked at was temporarily expanding the capacity of the estate. Now, I know that you and your officials are in regular contact with our colleagues down south, and so are you able to help the committee understand why was that not felt to be an option up here as an alternative to prisoner release?
So the member's right. I have had fairly regular engagement with UK counterparts. It's been a very constructive engagement. We've both been very keen to understand what the plans are for each of our establishments, and also where we can share information. We've been very keen to share information, but again, the context of that sharing of information has always been an absolutely explicit understanding that we will take whatever course of action as is necessary for the prison service in our own jurisdictions. And so what is right for prisons in England and Wales may not be right for prisons in Scotland, or indeed prisons in Northern Ireland. And it would be worth saying that the UK government, of course, did announce release up to 4,000 prisoners. I think my latest understanding is after a number of weeks of that scheme, they've looked to either abandon that or suspend that temporarily, potentially. Worth noting in Northern Ireland, they've taken a similar approach to Scotland. They have an early release scheme, which I think is also for prisoners with less than 3 months, or 3 months or less of their sentence as well. So the reason why we looked at the early release scheme is, one, it is the quickest amount of time to help us alongside HDC reduce the population, which is important because of the number of staff absences we have, because of our ability to then greatly increase single cell occupancy as well. So any other scheme, for example, looking at increasing capacity, I would struggle to see where we could do that and what capacity we could use to do that in any meaningful way. And custody settings themselves, as the Howard League evidence in front of you demonstrates, are custody settings really I was certainly ever attracted to, and I think we've got the right balance of a scheme that is, as I say, proportionate but necessary.
Thank you for that answer. Different tack now, just to clear up, because I think there's perhaps a little less understanding about this than there might be. So you and I looked, obviously, with others in the coronavirus bill yesterday. We discussed sunset clauses. Can you help the committee and anyone watching this understand when will this SSI lapse precisely, and what happens at that point? So, for example, if there's a prisoner who's not released by, let's say, 23:59 on the 30th of September, is that it? They're not eligible for release under this scheme, and they serve their sentences in accordance with the normal rules?
Yes, you're right to say that the regulations going for 180 days. Unless, of course, the government chooses to withdraw them, or indeed they're not approved. And yes, I mean that would essentially be the end of the early release scheme. I'm not aware of there being any additional flexibility in that regard. I will ask one of my officials, Craig, who's with me on the legal side, just to make sure I've got that absolutely right. What I would say, of course, is bear in mind, although this is an early release scheme, we have the normal release scheme that progresses anyway as per normal. So any given week, 100 to 150 prisoners would be released anyway. So those individuals who missed the cut-off point would potentially, of course, be released at a later date. What I would say about when you mentioned September, bear in mind that the early release scheme that we have in place at the moment is for a 28-day period. And it's happening in 3 tranches. We've had the first tranche already, which was the first 2 weeks of the scheme. The next tranche is this week, and then the final week will be the third tranche. And it is within those that 4-week period, within the 28-day period, that we are releasing anywhere between 300 to 450 prisoners, depending on the governor's veto. So actually, after the 28-day period, there isn't another early release scheme planned. However, that obviously can be kept under review as things stand. But at the moment, I'm not considering another early release scheme within the 180-day time frame. But of course, that could potentially change depending on the population, the prison population. But if it's okay, I may bring Craig in just to clarify some of the legal issues. He's our principal legal advisor on this.
Thanks, Cabinet Secretary. The expedited procedure under the Coronavirus Scotland Act it provides for the regulations to be in force for a period of 28 days. If they are approved within that period, then they can extend for 180 days. The regulations we have produced, have been structured so that the eligibility of prisoners is determined by reference to the first day that they were in force alone. So prisoners there will be a tranche of prisoners who are identified on day one who will be released or eligible for release over the course of the regulations. The regulations plan for the release to be phased over the initial 28 days. That was worked out because the urgency of the requirement to release people and the guarantee that the regulations will certainly be enforced for 28 days. If the Parliament doesn't approve them, they will fall after that 28-day period. I should say that anyone released in that 28-day period would continue to be released even if the regulations do fall on day 28. And anyone who is eligible and obtains eligibility during that 28-day period, and that's by reference to the time they have left to serve on the day that the regulations come into force. Anyone who is eligible but is not released during that 28-day period, possibly on grounds of health, if they are showing symptoms of coronavirus, they can be released after the 28 days because their eligibility will not fall when the regulations fall. And that's by reference to the Interpretation and Legislative Reform Act.
Thank you very much. That's very, very helpful from both of you. Thank you. Final question from me, Cabinet Secretary. Disappointingly, and I know you'll share my disappointment on this, there are some examples, not many, but some examples of those having been released under this scheme already reoffending. Now, you said at the start that you're in regular touch with the likes of local authorities and the WISE group, I think you mentioned. Can you give the committee any reassurance of what's being done to ensure that local authorities and criminal justice partners have the resources that they need to try and prevent this reoffending and to try and help keep anyone released early to stay on the straight and narrow?
Thanks to Liam Kerr again for the question. I share your disappointment, but at the same time, I have always been very careful when talking about the early release scheme not to make a suggestion that everybody that will be released will somehow stay out of prison. That simply would not be the case. We know that the individuals we're dealing with, and I know you know this from the work that you've done in the Justice Committee, have complex needs, often chaotic lifestyles, and the services available to them are at this time somewhat limited compared to if we were not in lockdown measures. So as a result, you're absolutely right, there's been some publicity around certainly one of the cases where individuals have had to return back to custody. In terms of the direct answer to your question, certainly resource has been part of the conversation, COSLA, and what I have done is the additional 4 million that we gave to local authorities for community justice measures. What we've done is allowed that to be used in a flexible manner, therefore can be used in essence to help in relation to the early release scheme as well. I have regular phone calls with the WISE group, and I've also had a conversation with SACRO as well, and continue to make the case to them that if they feel there is a need to look at further resource, that then my door is a very open one. But so far, in the work that they're doing, they're managing to reprofile some of their spend
Okay, thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I've got Patrick Harvey wants to come in with a supplementary to the last question.
Thank you, Convener, and good afternoon, Cabinet Secretary. I'm sure that your own officials and everybody in the prison service have been working extremely hard in these new circumstances to try and adapt. But one of the effects of the current situation, as the Howard League's written evidence to the committee points out, is that a lot of the activity that would normally be happening inside prisons to prepare prisoners for release isn't possible. Given that, it does strike me as a little surprising that this earlier release scheme doesn't come with an already developed package of additional measures to support prisoners who are being released, given that they won't have had that support in the time running up to their release. Can you give us some reassurance that there will be measures in place for all prisoners being released early to compensate for the fact that they haven't had that additional support in pre-release preparation that would normally be the case?
So it's a very valid point made by yourself and also the Howard League, an organisation I respect greatly in matters of penal reform. When it comes to the through care support, it would, I think, be worthwhile for the committee at some point. I know you've got a lot of business. At some point to hear from the WISE group and from SACRO. I don't think I'd be speaking out of turn if I was to say that their communication on the processes that we have in place, support that we have in place, collaboration between prison service, they tell me is the best that they have ever seen. And it's, it should not have taken a pandemic, and I agree with that point, to have to put in place that level of support. And the WISE group and SACRO themselves have had a big role to play in that. So the Liberation Pact, they have proactively, they're giving out to prisoners under the early release scheme, would include things, for example, for the WISE group, an ASDA voucher, which would be enough for the individual to buy a mobile phone, a very basic mobile phone, but a mobile phone so that individual can contact their mentor. In case of SACRO's programme, the SHINE programme, which is for female prisoners being released, they're actually given a mobile phone in their liberation. And what we're doing is, because we have really detailed information on who's being released and some of the support that they need, local authorities are able to support upon liberation those individuals to the best of their ability, understanding that, of course, there are limitations. But I would say the prisoners that are being released under this scheme certainly get more support than I think before. And this is an example working side of this COVID-19 pandemic processes back to actually this process we have in the collaboration we have between partners is something we want to embed even post COVID-19.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I think it's fair to say some of us were having difficulty hearing some of that answer you gave to Patrick Harvey. I think you might have been having one or two microphone difficulties there. I'm just wondering if it might be helpful if you were to write to the committee just to put on record the answers you've just given. I'm not sure how much of it the official report will actually have caught. Okay, thank you. Okay, we'll move on to Monica Lennon, please.
Thank you, Convener, and good afternoon, Cabinet Secretary. I was able to hear most of what you said, and hopefully you can hear me. If I can pick up on just some practical issues, similar to what Annabel Ewing was asking at the beginning, and I was pleased to hear you say that you've worked closely with COSLA and Councillor Parry and other colleagues, so that's reassuring. But I wanted to ask about the plans that are in place to support a prisoner release under this scheme. I wasn't aware of a turnaround as short as 24 hours, but I am aware that in local authorities, it varies across the country, but lots of staff have been absent for coronavirus reasons. So I just wonder if you could say more about the plans that are in place to support that release in terms of housing support and what is in place to try and minimise, wherever possible, the risk of homelessness. And related to that, have local authorities been given extra resource to assist with that, and the third sector also? And then just a separate matter, I wanted to ask about testing. I know colleagues in Parliament had raised the issue of regular testing for prisoners before release. I don't think that was supported at the time, but we're learning more all the time, especially about people who are asymptomatic and have the virus. So I wonder if you can give an update on your thinking on that. And I think you said at the beginning that under this scheme, as of last night, 240 prisoners have been released. I think I've got the figure correct. Are you able to advise, or your officials, how many of those individuals were tested for coronavirus?
Okay, thank you very much. It may well be my internet connection because I missed some of what you said, but I think I managed to pick up the gist of it. So if I don't address any of your questions, obviously you can come back to me. In terms of the housing support and other support, I'd also, put an emphasis on addiction services because of the cohort and the population obviously we're dealing with. I would say, again, similar to my answer to Patrick Harvey, that notwithstanding the very difficult challenges that Monica Lennon, that you articulate very well in relation to staff absences and pressure on local government, notwithstanding all of that, the service being received has been really first class. And that's not not simply my observation. It's the observation that I've had from COSLA, and it's also the observation, I've had from partners such as the WISE Group and SACRO. What I have asked COSLA after my last phone call with Kelly Parry this week was if she can come back to me with any particular concerns from any specific local authorities in and around any gaps in service, and I'll look to address that very specifically. And so far they've not come back to me yet, COSLA, but I'm due another phone call with them next week. What I'd say on the housing side, things seem to be progressing really well because, again, we have the 12-week list. Accommodation has been able to be found. I'm not aware of any prisoner coming out having having any housing issues. There was one or two anecdotal stories that the Wise Group were able to tell me where there was perhaps a mix-up when a prisoner was released in relation to their housing and where they were meant to attend to go to that housing provision. But that was very quickly resolved by the fact that the individual was able to contact the Wise Group, who were then able to contact the council and get that issue resolved really, really quickly. So we are looking into that on a really regular basis where we possibly can. On testing, the latest position is that in 9 of our prison establishments, the health boards have taken a position to test prisoners if they are symptomatic. And our conversations, our prison services conversations with the other health boards indicate that we expect every prison establishment to be testing prisoners if they are displaying symptoms of COVID-19. So not asymptomatic, but if they are symptomatic, are presenting symptoms. I won't rehearse the kind of limitations on testing, and of course we continue to monitor the developments in testing. We know there are limitations around what testing can tell you at that specific moment, at that specific time. So what we've done on the early release scheme is we have engaged the health professionals who are within that prison, and if they believe an individual is COVID-19 positive, and of course that can be reaffirmed by the testing in those 9 establishments, then they have the ability to delay an individual's release till they think they are no longer COVID-19 positive. So there is that additional safeguard where the health professionals within the prison are able to make that judgment and delay any early release.
Convener, just a brief supplementary, and I don't know if the part of the question about how many of the released prisoners had been tested, if you're not able to give that answer, if you could write to the committee, that would be helpful. But we did, as a committee, take evidence from Sir Harry Burns just a couple of weeks ago, and he talked about within health and social care settings, staff unwittingly transmitting the virus because they were asymptomatic. So we are learning more and more all the time. So you did mention, Cabinet Secretary, that the testing policy seems to be linked to people having symptoms. So I just wondered, given further things that you've heard in recent weeks and days, if that's something that you're looking to revisit with your officials.
Well, first and foremost, when it comes to those who work in a prison service, they have access to the drive through testing facilities, and they'd be making good use of those, and that can be demonstrated by the fact that a number of those who are absent have now returned, and the absence rates in our prisons have dropped from a high of around about 25% to around about closer to 17-18%. So there is that testing facility available for the staff. What I would say is that the prison policy is very much aligned to Health Protection Scotland advice as it currently stands. If that develops, if that changes, then of course the prison service will look to potentially change their guidance also, but they are very much aligned with the national guidance. I will write to you in terms of the numbers that have been tested, and if they were not symptomatic, they would not be tested as per the guidance, and nobody thus far has had their release delayed because they've been displaying COVID-19 symptoms.
Okay,
thank you.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Thank you to Monica Lennon. Next on my list is Shona Robeson, and after Shona it will be Stuart Stevenson.
Afternoon, Cabinet Secretary. In your opening remarks, you said that the statistics on prisoner release will be on the SPS website. And I just wanted to ask, will this be broken down by age and local authority? And will and I'm sorry if you've mentioned this, but I didn't catch it if you did, will SBS publish information about how many vetoes that prisoner governors have used?
Yes, information that is published, information on the SPS website has been published, can be found on the website, broken down by age. It can be broken down by local authority. It's broken down by prison establishment. It's broken down by gender as well. So there's quite a lot of detail in relation to the numbers that have been released. I should say that statistical bulletin or report is released after every tranche. So the next one will be next week in terms of the detail. And in relation to whether or not it also gives information on the governor's veto, yes, it does give a breakdown of how many of the governor's veto, how many cases the governor's veto has applied. And if my memory serves me correctly, I don't have the report in front of me. That is also broken down by establishment, so, and how many cases were vetoed per establishment as well.
Okay, thank you for that. That's helpful. Also, if you could let us know, as the first tranche of prisoner release comes to an end, are there early signs of progress on prisoner occupancy rates? Again, my apologies if you touched on that, but what's your has it been as effective as you hoped it would have been?
Short answer is yes. So early release scheme is not the only tool we have in our armoury to deal with the prison population. We also, as you probably know, on the Justice Committee have home detention curfew as well, and home detention curfew has been ramping up as well. So combined with early release, we now have greater single cell occupancy across the estate. And bear in mind, it's worth just remembering where we were pre-pandemic. Pre-pandemic, almost every single one of our prisons was overcrowded, and some of them very severely overcrowded. Ability was close to 150% overcrowded, and we're now in a position where we are down to just below 7,000 in custody, so well below kind of operating and design capacity across the estate, which is good. What I've never done, and I won't be able to do, is give you an absolute guarantee at what number we have. Definitively, we can have single cell occupancy at every single prison establishment. That's because, you know, every single prison is, of course, configured differently. There are in some prisons more long-term prisoners, prisoners on life sentences, more sex offenders, for example, who are obviously not released under this scheme. And in some prisons, of course, we have a mixed population. And although we may have single cells available in the female hall or wing of the prison, we obviously would not transfer males into those single cells. I would be very careful to say that what we'll see through the early release scheme and through HDC and the other measures we've taken is a greater availability of single cell occupancy, and we have seen that. There's already now some establishment where we're down to single cell occupancy, and I only expect that to continue as the scheme progresses.
Okay, thank you, Shona. Patrick Harvey, for a brief supplementary, please.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. Just on that point that was being explored, it has been suggested that the biggest driver of the reduction in the prison population has actually been the reduction in court business rather than the other measures that you've mentioned. As court business resumes, are you able to produce a projection for what you expect prison population to be, even with these new measures, such as prisoner release, or is it impossible to say?
Yeah. So it's absolutely correct to say that the biggest driver in the population reduction has been the reduction in court business. There's just simply no variety around that. That has been the single biggest driver. early release and home detention curfew have certainly played their part, but it's without doubt the reduction in court business or the biggest driver in that regard. So my concern is as crime levels begin to come back to normal levels, and we're beginning to see that, the Chief Constable and his deputies tell me we're beginning to see crime levels come back to some sort of normality, and you can expect as restrictions are eased as per the roadmap published today, that you'll begin to see that normality of crime levels, that those crime levels normalise even further. We're already seeing that have an impact on the prison population to the extent that this week, if we did not have the early release scheme and we did not have home detention curfew, the prison population actually would have increased this week, being the first time the prison population would have increased since lockdown measures. The second part of the question is a piece of work that we're doing at the moment internally. I have to confess it's a very difficult piece of work because we don't know at what rate court business will resume. That's obviously another part of the work that I'm engaged in at the moment, but also is very much dependent on the Scottish Courts and Tribunal Service and very much dependent on other factors and as well. So that work has been done. It is why we continue to keep early release under review. Although I'm not at this stage contemplating another early release scheme, I would not rule it out if it's necessary to keep our prison population low, because that is what we need to do, keep our prisons as safe as a working environment as possible.
Okay, thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Last questions go to Stuart Stevenson, please.
Cabinet Secretary, I am making the assumption that, of course, early release does not remove a single day from the sentence that has been imposed on the person subject to that early release, and that therefore their sentence continues after they are released into the community until the expiry of their sentence. Assuming that I'm correct in that, does that therefore mean that these people could be subject, if appropriate, to recall to custody? Because, of course, that's quite important, because the grounds for recall are not those which are required for a new conviction under the criminal justice system, but are more straightforward, might be difficult for the victims of crime or difficult for the community at large. Is that recall something that's still in operation?
So, if I can bring in Craig McGuffey, who again is our principal legal officer, he'll be able to give you the legals on this. But in certain limited circumstances, it may well be possible for the courts to recall. But of course, when somebody is released, for all intents and purposes, it is as if they were released at their liberation date. But Craig, can I bring you in just to make sure I have that right?
Certainly, thank you, Cabinet Secretary. The cohort of prisoners who are being released just now are all short-term prisoners. That means that they're serving sentences of less than 4 years. So when they're released at the halfway stage of their sentence, they're released unconditionally. There's no licence condition in place. Those prisoners are still serving their sentence in the community, but they're not subject to licence conditions. If they were to commit a further offence during the currency of that sentence, during the second half of their sentence, they could be returned to prison to serve the rest of that sentence. So it's not a recall, as would be the case for somebody out in licence. It's more the prospect of return to prison if they commit further offences. So none of the cohort that are being released just now, I should say as well, sorry, that everyone released just now would be treated in accordance with the Coronavirus Act, would be treated as if they are released at the halfway stage of their sentence unconditionally. So this is almost like us bringing forward that halfway stage of their sentence. Everyone who is now out on release will be subject to serve their sentence in the community up until the expiry of that sentence.
So I suppose in essence, I be careful with my language. They could return to prison to serve the rest of their sentence, but not recalled as Craig's remarks.
Okay, thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Thank you to Stuart Stevenson. I think that's all the questions we have to put. So I thank the Cabinet Secretary for giving his evidence. I now need to ask members if members are content not to make any recommendations to the Parliament on the negative SSI. That's the Criminal Justice Miscellaneous Temporary Modifications Coronavirus Scotland Regulations 2020, SSI 2020/137. If any member disagrees with that, if they can type N into the chat bar now. I'm not seeing any disagreement to that. We can therefore now move on to item 2 on the agenda, which is a consideration of the motion on the affirmative SSI, and I would invite the Minister to move motion S5M 21738 that the COVID-19 Committee recommends that the release of prisoners Coronavirus Scotland Regulations 2020, SSI 2020/138 be approved.
Move, Convener.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I'm assuming no members want to speak in relation to that motion. I'm not seeing anyone indicate that. I therefore put the question. The question is the motion S5M 21738 be agreed to. Does any member disagree? If so, they should please type N into the chat bar at this point. We are not agreed, and there will therefore be a division. Members of the committee will be familiar with the voting system, I'm sure. Can I ask firstly those members who are in agreement to the motion to type Y into the chat bar now, please? Thank you. Can I ask members who disagree, type N into the chat bar now? And can I ask any members abstaining to chat A into the chat bar now? Thank you. There'll now be a short pause while we just verify the outcome of the vote. And I have the results of the vote, which are as follows. In favour of the motion, we have Willie Coffey, Annabel Ewing, Fiona Robson, Stuart Stevenson, Monica Lennon, Patrick Harvey and Beatrice Wishart. There were no votes against and there were 2 abstentions in the name of Liam Kerr and myself. That's therefore 7 votes in favour and 2 votes, no votes against and 2 abstentions, and that motion is therefore carried. Thank you. So the committee will now report to Parliament, setting out a decision on the statutory instrument in the coming days. That's the last item on our agenda. Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary and his officials, and I can thank members, and I now close the meeting. Thank you.